Hi, Stephanie, can you hear me? Here's Lars Feld speaking. Are you already there? We said 6:15, but I think we are almost complete. 2 or 3 people still miss, but perhaps I can start by introducing you to the people, and then you can start with your keynote to this conference, and I think we are going to have some time for discussion afterwards. Is this okay?
Yes,
Perfect.
That sounds good. Can you hear me?
We can hear you pretty well, and we can see you also. I hope you can see me as well. So the staff in the back told me that the camera is always focused on this desk, so that you might also see me. When we are later going to have this Q&A, I think I'm going to repeat some of the questions, but still we also have microphones, so perhaps it's sufficient if you hear the question and do not necessarily need to see the people who ask the questions, but I can tell you who they are. I hope so, at least. Yeah, well, let me begin. Also, 2 or 3 people still check in the hotel, I guess. Well, actually, like in other cases, almost all the people in the room should know who Stephanie Schmitt-Grohé is. But I'll take the opportunity to make at least a few remarks on her CV. Stephanie is currently professor at the Colombia University in New York. Actually, she started studying economics in Germany at the University of Münster. Then moved to the US and finished with an MBA degree in finance at the City University of New York, and a PhD in economics at the University of Chicago then afterwards. She worked at several universities and also at other institutions. So, for example, first of all, after her PhD at the Federal Reserve Board from '94 to '98, she was professor at Rutgers University, then at Duke University, and since 2008 at Columbia University. Stephanie has written extensively, so when you look at her papers and publications overall, you see so many entries that I can't really summarize them. She worked on international macroeconomic issues, monetary economics, also fiscal policy questions, and so on. So I could read through all these different papers, and I would take much of your time, Stephanie. So I think the best would be that you are talking to us and give your keynote address to the conference. This conference is organized jointly by Stiftung Geld und Währung. We translated it as Foundation of Money and Currency, and the Walter Eucken Institut at the University of Freiburg. And we are very, very happy that you agreed to give the keynote speech to us. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lars, for inviting me and for your very kind and generous introduction. So let me share my screen and tell you what I am planning to talk about today in my 45 minutes. And if you have problems seeing or hearing what I'm saying, please intervene. And I don't know how it is organized, but I also don't mind if there are questions in the middle if people want to ask me something. So I assume you can see the slides. This is joint work with Martin Uribe, and we have been thinking lately, well, not very original, I guess, like everyone else, what is going on? Why is inflation so very high, not just in the United States, but throughout a large number of advanced countries? And so we started thinking about, can we learn something or some answers to this question, why is inflation so high, if we look at long data? So our argument is the following. We say modern business cycle analysis is a story told with post-war data. So that's the theme of this project. And before COVID-19, probably this approach to research made a lot of sense. The post-war period had been very calm relative to what we call pre-post-war, by which we mean, first half of the 20th century. And it seemed like that period was out of touch with the business cycles we experienced post 1955. And this assessment, as I said, made a lot of sense. How long did it make a lot of sense? Maybe it only made a lot of sense until 2008, when we had the global financial crisis. But here, our focus is on the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have seen there are large, short-lived fluctuations in output and inflation. And perhaps the type of fluctuations we have seen over the last 2 years are more akin to what we saw in the first half of the 20th century. And maybe we can actually put that statement the other way around. If we would say the post-war period was out of touch with the post-war period, we might now want to say the post-war period in terms of volatility and fluctuations seems out of touch with current developments. So that's our premise of this exploration. And in today's talk, I'm just gonna address two very specific questions. And the first question is going to be, can we understand the inflation spike that came with COVID as driven by a permanent component inflation? So what's a permanent component in inflation could be interpreted as being an anchoring of long-run inflation expectations, or it could be interpreted as a permanent change in the inflation target, willingly or unwillingly by the central bank. So let's think about Japan. The official inflation target is 2%, but actions over the last 25 years have never brought it there. So that would be the permanent component of inflation in Japan is very low. So we want to know how much is there permanent in the COVID-19 inflation spike? And I guess that's also a question many people are thinking about. How transitory is it and how permanent is it? And we are a little bit more specific. We want to know how much of the spike is due to the permanent component in inflation. And then the second question that sort of follows from our premise that telling a story with post-war data might be out of place, we want to ask the question, is it still true if we consider periods with more volatile data that fighting high inflation with high transitory interest rates will still work? So that's the two specific questions we are going to address in this paper. So specifically what we do is we conduct an econometric exercise. We estimate what we call a semi-structural model of three variables. We just want to learn something about output, inflation, and the nominal interest rate. And the paper thus far focuses on the US, and it focuses on annual data. And the exercise is to consider two periods. What we are going to call the long sample is going to be 1900 until the most recent annual data, 2021. So we have COVID in there. And then the short sample, which we are going to identify with 1955 to 2021. Sometimes we also call that the post-war sample. I am aware that the war didn't end in 1955, but very often in the related literature, the type of data that people use starts in 1955 or around 1955. Say, the seminal Cristiano Eichenbaum and Evans paper on the effects of monetary policy shocks starts in the late 50s. So we have two results to report. The first one is, if we use long data and we ask the question, how much of the inflation spike that came with COVID, the model attributes to the permanent component, we get, well, depending how you take it, but some people would say the good news, we get the good news that very little of it is attributed to a permanent component. We get the answer that only 57 basis points of the inflation spike that came with COVID is attributed to a permanent component. All the other things is either have to be other shocks. I'll introduce them a little bit later. However, if we go with the usual theme of telling business cycle stories or the narratives of business cycle analysis with post-war data, that is, if we limit attention to the period 1955 to 2021, we come to a different conclusion. Namely, we conclude that a large chunk, namely 226 basis points of the inflation spike that we saw in the US between 2019 and 2021 was due to the permanent component. And just to get your numbers right, maybe everyone is thinking right now, oh, I have the most recent inflation report in mind and said that inflation in the US went up 8.6%. We are using annual data, and the inflation spike in 2021 was only about 280 basis points at that point for the annual data. So saying that we attribute 226 basis points to the permanent component when we use post-war data is to say that we attribute 80% of the observed change in the inflation rate between pre-COVID and now to the permanent component. So that matters because it gives a very different interpretation of the data, and it gives a different guidance to the monetary authority how to behave. So that's one result about maybe limiting attention to the post-war period is no longer the right thing to do. And then the second result is that, however, the estimated effects of monetary policy shocks, and therefore what we understand about the monetary transmission mechanism, is not much affected whether we look at the short or the long sample. As I will show you, the estimated effect of transitory and permanent monetary shocks is not exactly the same, but is very much the same across the two samples. So let me say a couple of minutes something about the model, and then but that's going to be very short, and then I show you what the model gives us. So I said we use a semi-structural model. So this is an exercise in which, as I mentioned, we want to say something about the dynamics of pi, which is the inflation rate. This is CPI headline. Why is it going to be CPI headline? Because that's the time series that we can get since 1900. This about the short run normal interest rate. For most of the more recent sample, this is actually the US policy rate, the federal funds rate, and then the log of real GDP per capita. And we postulate that all of these three variables are potentially non-stationary. And so the permanent shocks that they drive them are threefold, or potentially drive them. There is XM, which is the permanent monetary shock. That's the shock I'm interested in mainly in today's talk. So can there be a change in long run inflation expectations? Can there be a permanent change in the inflation target? In the US, has the inflation target been lower in the last 15 years, say, than in the 60s and 70s? So we want to learn something about XM. We also want to include a permanent component in the natural rate shock. So that speaks to the recent literature on R star. Has there been a change in the natural rate? I'm not going to talk much about what we find in that regard. That is mainly in the companion paper from which the empirical results I show here today are taken. But that paper has, I think the title makes it clear. It says secular movements in the real interest rate. And then we have X, which is just a standard permanent productivity shock. So we split the time series into a cyclical component and a permanent component. But we are not going down the Burrage-Nelson route or Blanchard-Croix. So I just want to explain with these three equations a little bit which way we go. So we say that pi hat, which is the cyclical component of inflation, which we cannot see, which is latent, and we just define it as the inflation that we see minus its permanent component. So we are interested in trying to estimate this permanent component and want to know if it changed recently. And the same logic applies to the federal funds rate, the short-term normal interest rate. We say that it is non-stationary and it's in principle driven by two permanent components. Suppose we forget about XR and we just look at XM. Suppose alpha is 0, what would that mean? That would mean that if the permanent component of inflation goes up by 1 percentage points, then in the long run, the normal interest rate would move 1 for 1. That means in the long run, the Fisher effect holds. What if alpha ends up being positive? Suppose, I think the easiest way to understand what we're thinking about is, let's go back to 1980. Maybe you agree that the permanent component of inflation fell between 1980 and now. So if alpha is bigger than 1, that would mean that the normal interest rate falls by more than 1 for 1. That would mean that the real interest rate falls. So that would give a story in which there would be a causal result from the permanent component of inflation falling to the natural rate of interest falling. And what would be the policy implication? Well, now, if we think the permanent component of inflation goes up, well, then we would say also the natural rate of interest would go up. So it would be, to put it in the jargon of the literature, would mean normalization is the end of low real rates, right? So that's why this is something we're interested in, what alpha is. And then, of course, we can also have changes in the natural rate of interest that have no monetary nature, that are coming from its own source. And that is what is studied, say, in the secular stagnation literature. So in particular, the question there is, if the real interest rate changes, does it have an effect on output, on the trend of output? So that would be a question, what happens to delta? I'm not going to talk at all about this. This is in our companion paper on secular movements in real interest rates. Okay, so that's just a definition between cycle and permanent component. I'm going to just really briefly show you how we tease out of the data what alpha is, what delta is, what XM, XR, and X is. These are all latent variables, as well as the cyclical components. So we just postulate that the cyclical components follow an AR1 process. We're trying to find these B's, and that they respond to the 5 shocks in the model. I already introduced you to the 3 permanent shocks, and we also have 2 transitory shocks. Namely, ZM is the traditional stationary monetary shock that has been used extensively over the past 20 years to learn something about what the monetary transmission mechanism is, and that's the one, I guess. What we learned from studying the effects of a shock of that type is in part what gives us confidence that a way to fight high inflation is with transitory increases in the nominal rate. And all right, so that's the structure, and we assume that the permanent that all of the shocks are univariate AR1 processes. So rho is diagonal and psi is also diagonal. What distinguishes our approach from some VAR approaches or others in the literature is that the goal of the exercise is to identify all 5 structural parameters, so we can say something about what is the impulse response to a permanent change in the inflation, in the permanent component of inflation or in the inflation target. What is the impulse response to an identified transitory monetary policy shock? And then in the companion paper, we ask these questions about shocks to the natural rate. How this is everything on this slide is latent. So how do we deal with this? We use the standard Kalman filter approach. We say there are a bunch of variables that we can link as identities to all these latent variables. In particular, it's going to be output growth, the change in consumer price inflation, and the change in the federal funds rate. We can link them to these latent variables. Somebody paid particular good attention, you will immediately see how this works here. This is a change in inflation. We know that the cyclical component of inflation is pi minus xm. So if you take the difference between the cyclical components, you obtain that you also have there the change in the permanent component, and then we allow for measurement errors. Okay, we're not gonna bore you with how this is done. I just want to say something about the data we put in. This is annual US data, and the main exercise here is to compare the long sample, which is meant to be 1900 to 2021, and then the post-war sample 1955 to 2021. And we want to compare what are the differences in the results. The data is taken from Jorda, Schuler, Rick, and Taylor. Their data ends in 2017, so we had to add 4 more observations. And any details on the identification scheme, the priors, the estimation technique are in this other paper on the permanent component of the natural rate of interest. So what do we find? So the first result, which I had mentioned in the introduction, is we are estimating the model on data since 1900 to most recent annual data, 2021. And we are showing here 2 lines. The blue line is this latent variable, the permanent component of inflation, and the red line is inflation. So let me first talk briefly about the data. As you can see, that the behavior of inflation in 1900 to 1955 is quite different than the behavior of inflation after 1955. Prior to 1955, inflation was extremely volatile. So we have positive spikes of 15%, declines to minus 11%. And so besides having large bursts of inflation and deflation, there were various of them. So I can count at least 6 big spikes, and they were all quite short-lived. So let's single out one. The biggest one in the pre-war period is this one here. This is the spike in US inflation between 1915 and 1918. This happens to include the influenza pandemic of 1918, but this inflation, as you can see here, increased already much earlier, started increasing in 1915. Why? Well, I don't want to pitch into that debate, but a common narrative is that fiscal pressures, in particular expenditures related to World War I, put pressure on inflation going higher and maybe using seniorage to finance these fiscal expenditures. But I don't want to endorse that view or not. But what I want to point out, it was a massive spike and it was really short-lived. So we go from 1915 to 1918, inflation goes from 1% to 17%, and from 1918 to 1921, we are back to minus 11%, so extremely volatile. And there were a bunch of those really volatile episodes, and you see that the blue line, which is our estimate of the permanent component of inflation, basically sees through this, and maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but basically this is a horizontal line in the pre-war period, and it gives a little bit to the influenza pandemic, but the permanent component only goes up 2 percentage points and down. So it's very little of this is attributed to the permanent component, and nothing of these other big spikes is given to the permanent component. The post-war period is really different. If we return to the red line, to actual inflation, there's just one story in the post-war period, is the great inflation of the 70s. That took 15 to 20 years to build up. So in 1960, inflation was about 2%, took almost 20 years to reach 10% in 1980. And then Volker came and instituted the big disinflation. Inflation took another 6 years to reach mid-1960s levels and then stayed low until this most recent spike. So how does a model that is given experiences of just one very slow building inflation and many crazy inflation bursts up or down, how does the semi-structural model interpret that data? Well, it says that, roughly speaking, these were all not events of the permanent component changing, only the great inflation of the 70s had a permanent flavor to it. So they saw a big spike here and they say this was permanent because it was a slow building up. Then this model sees what happens here. They see the most recent spike in inflation and they say, well, how does data inform you about how to interpret this? And the model says that basically nothing of that is the permanent component. In fact, as I said in the introduction, and this increase in the permanent component of inflation is only 57 basis points, whereas the total increase of inflation is 277 basis points. So the model says clearly the increase in inflation that the US saw is not permanent. There's a tiny bit that is permanent, but looking back in history, we think we know those type of very sudden bursts of inflation, and they tend not to last. So if we now do go back to what is the standard paradigm in business cycle analysis, namely to tell the story using post-war data from 1955, we are feeding the model with a very different inflation experience. So here the red line is just a chunk from the previous graph, but starts in 1955. And you can see that the red line just tells one story, namely the great inflation of the 70s that went from the mid 1960s until it peaked in 1980. And then Volcker came in and took him 5-6 years to bring inflation down. So like estimating the model on the long data, this is clearly the great inflation of the 70s is interpreted by the model as a permanent component. But what caught our attention and why we thought it was important to report it to other people is that if you ask that model, what do you think about the inflation spike that came with COVID? The model says, no, hands down, this is permanent. So, this such a massive spike in inflation, we haven't seen very much given our experience, which we have to interpret the data. The only way we can interpret it is that it is permanent. So they say the permanent component rose by 80% of the actual increase in inflation. So you might ask yourself, well, which one is right? Do we know? I mean, right now, we don't know. Is the estimation on the short sample right, or is the estimation on the long sample right? And we cannot tell, and even with time, we might not be able to tell because other shocks might happen, and those might change the permanent component. But from an economic point of view, it seems, or at least that's how we interpret it, that if we go to a period, I mean, here I only show inflation, but if you also look at output, that has become much more volatile, it seems reasonable that the post-war period has not much information to inform these drastic events like the 2008 financial crisis and now the COVID crisis. But the longer period data that is full of these sudden stop and goes and sudden bursts of inflation and deflation might have much more experience in how to handle those episodes. And thus we argue on, well, our economic common sense. We think this interpretation of events, we regard it as more plausible, that the current inflation spike due to COVID is not one in which the permanent component of inflation rose. And so we argue that what we say based on this, maybe telling the business cycle story with post-war data might be, well, can lead to very different conclusions. That's what we said. But we also think it might not lead necessarily to the most insightful conclusions. So that's the first set of results I wanted to report. And the second set of results is, okay, you just showed us that what the model thinks is the permanent component of inflation changed by a lot. What about what we all hold true about the monetary transmission mechanism, isn't it then also possible that maybe the monetary transmission mechanism changed greatly between the long and the short sample? And as I will now show you, our answer to that question is there hasn't been much of a change. The results are very similar. So let me go warm you up on what I'm going to show you, but I'm going to now ask, what are the effects of identified short-term monetary policy shock, which is the ZMT, which is the shock that has been studied in hundreds of papers since probably before, but probably since the seminal paper of Cassiano, Eichenbaum, and Evans, and that has informed our way of modeling normal rigidity, so the effects of monetary policy. And I also want to show you estimates of what are the impulse responses to a change in XM. And so the questions that will arise here is, what is this value alpha in part? So as I said before, one way of asking what alpha is, does the Fisher effect hold in the long run? That is to say, if the permanent component of inflation goes up by 1 percentage point, inflation, by definition of the permanent component, will have to go up by 1 percentage points in the long run. But the question is, by how much will the normal interest rate go up and hence the real interest rate? So if alpha is 0, then the normal interest rate goes up by 1 for 1. And we have long run neutrality in the sense of Fisher. So the real rate is unaffected by monetary policy, like argued in Lucas's Nobel lecture and argued by Irving Fisher himself in 1896. And the alternative would be that alpha is not 0. Suppose alpha, as I said before, is positive, then we would say that a decline in the permanent component of inflation would lead to a more than 1 for 1 decline in the normal interest rate. So that would yield a story in which we would say, oh, the decline in the real rate observed between 1980 and now, where we saw that the permanent component of inflation fell, brought with it the decline of real rates. And so a normalization that might come now would signal the end of low real rates. Okay, and so that's going to be one of the things we are interested in. And then another thing that we are interested in is the transmission mechanism of XM in the short run still the same. So why is that useful? That helps us to think about if in the current environment where central banks in advanced countries that experience high inflation will raise rates sooner or later. The US already has tightened several times. The ECB is going to do that very soon. So we will learn what that will imply for output and inflation, right? So let me show you these impulse responses. So this is the estimate of the impulse response to a transitory and a permanent monetary policy shock, and this is telling the story using post-war data. So this is the sample 1955 to now. Let me start with the right column. That should be familiar. This is something that, as I said, has been done in slightly different ways by hundreds of related papers. And so the exercise here is, suppose there is a surprise increase in the federal funds rate by 1 percentage point in year 0. What are the effects of inflation and output? So this estimation tells us, this is after 4 years, the interest rate hike is over. What happens to inflation? There's a little bit of a price puzzle. As typical in that literature, inflation initially goes up, but then inflation goes down. So this is Cassiano, Eichenbaum, and Evans, more or less, but on annual data. These are transitory increases. And so, yes, a transitory increase in the federal funds rate can push down inflation. And is there a soft landing or is there a recession? As we all know, raising normal rates in the short run and transitorily has a cost. Here it says a 1 percentage point increase shaves off 0.5% of GDP. And then what about, well, maybe I go first from the right column here to changing the sample to going to long data. Does this insight go out of the window, or does this insight stay? So now I go to 1900 to 2021. And what do I see? Qualitatively, the answer is the same. So if the Fed tightens by 1 percentage point, that will result in pushing inflation down. Well, the point estimate is like 0.3% after 2-3 years, but it comes with a cost. Is gonna lower output. It's gonna shave off 0.5% or 0.6 of the level of the trend of output. What is important, just making as a comment to interpret current events, the ability to lower inflation with an interest rate hike is entirely premised on this interest rate hike to be transitory. That is to say, we're going to raise interest rates now, but this is transitory. So we're going to make the nominal interest rate temporarily higher. This graph implies that transitorily the real interest rate is higher, and so the mechanism is that the real interest rate is temporarily higher now than in the future, and that will slow down inflation. So that insight that is absolutely essential, that it has to be transitory, is, for example, in the behavior of the Fed. When the Fed tightened now, they were very clear. They're going to tighten now. They might tighten a couple of times more. They sort of suggested that maybe by the end of this year, nominal interest rates would reach between 3.25 and 3.5%. Maybe even by next year, they might rise. The federal funds rate might rise to as high a level as 3.75%. But that this is sort of an overshooting, and that they see the long run federal funds rate clearly below 3%. So, and the Fed was very explicit about it, that there's going to be a sort of moment of overshooting. And announcing that, the Fed makes it very clear that this is a transitory tightening. And we know from theory and data, this is only data here, that the transitory aspect is very important to be able to slow down inflation. So it cannot just be, oh yeah, we tighten and then we don't say what we do. It has to be that everybody understood, so that there's sort of an overshooting. And that is what is essential in lowering inflation. Okay, let's now go to the other component of the other monetary shock that concerns the central bank, as eventually, as at the end of the day, at least that's what I will argue, that who controls the level of the inflation rate in the long run is always the central bank, not in the short run, but in the long run. And so if there's a change in the long run level of inflation, what do we estimate? And the estimation, this is like in Uribe's 2022 Neo-Fisher paper, it says that if there's a shock that increases inflation in the long run by 1 percentage point, it also increases the nominal interest rate by 1 percentage point. So in terms of the model that we wrote here, it means that we estimate alpha to be 1. That means there is a long run, alpha to be 0, sorry. There's a long run Fisher effect. Permanent inflation shocks in the long run move nominal interest rates 1-for-1 and therefore have no effect on the real rate. So that would mean if one were concerned that normalization of rates that is coming now would mean the end of low real rates, at least our estimate would say no. And inflation actually jumps up faster than the normal rate. So the real rate in the transition falls. And as the real rate in the transition falls, that's what the Neo-Fisher effect is. It says that this type of long run increase in inflation is in the short run not contractionary. Why? Because inflation adjusts faster than the normal rate, at least in the data. Is that still true in the long sample? And we get exactly the same answer in the long sample. So if there's a shock that increases inflation in the long run by 1 percentage point, then first of all, it says it also increases the nominal interest rate in the long run by 1 percentage point. That's the first result. So alpha is also 0. meaning changes in the long run level of inflation do not drive the real interest rate in the long run. So it would say, no, the reason why the natural rate fell between 1980 and now was not because the inflation target was lowered. And no, as we now most likely normalize, it's not going to be that this is the end of real rates. And also in the long sample, again, if we do normalize, it is important to keep in mind that if we jump sort of on the bandwagon of, or say, well, a nice side effect of the COVID episode is that finally we can leave 15 years of being at the zero lower bound behind us. We can normalize interest rates, and we can maybe end up at normal interest rates that are maybe 8%, 2-3% instead of minus 50 basis points. What does this type of analysis tell you? Even if we look at more volatile data, we would say that a normalization of rates will bring with it more inflation, yes, but that's the intention, but it will not add to the contraction. The permanent component of the interest rate hike is not contractionary. If anything, is expansionary. So if we go back to telling the story of the Fed, when the Fed now announced that they were going to raise rates, they're going to overshoot, and then they're going to settle somewhere between 2 and 3%, or that's how it was interpreted, the announcement. Then the fact that the federal funds rate is going to be permanently higher should be associated with a permanently, hopefully leaving behind the zero lower bound, permanently higher inflation, and it should not be contractionary. So the guidelines that an estimated semi-structural model gives for conducting monetary policy, namely fighting inflation with temporarily raising the federal funds rate and moving away from being stuck at the zero lower bound by raising the normal rate, remains, whether you estimate on the volatile, including volatile data starting in 1900, or if you estimate beginning in the post-war data. So that's the second story. Okay. So let me conclude. So if we estimate if we want to know how to interpret the current post-COVID inflation spike or inflation burst, and we estimate it on post-war data, then at least the model that we estimate tells us this is all permanent. Not all, 80% is permanent. What type of newspaper story would that support? Well, there are people who argue that the massive expansion of the balance sheet of the Fed, of holding normal interest rates, not for 15 straight years, but for much of the past 15 years at zero. These were all monetary policy actions that sooner or later had to lead to very high inflation. Well, that would be one interpretation, or one, I don't know, newspaper explanation we could give to the result that we have, that if you estimate on post-war data, then you conclude that 80% of the COVID inflation spike is permanent. However, we argue that the post-war data does not include a lot of information on sudden inflation spurs. The only big inflation episode in the post-war data was the great inflation of the 70s. This was just a slow, long-lasting build-up and took many, many years to get to 10% inflation. And as we can see right now, current inflation is not taking 15 years from 1965 to 1980 to reach 10%. We might reach 8% this year already. So the model has no choice but to interpret this as a permanent component. But if we go to a sample that includes volatile, short-lived swings in inflation like those that we observed in the first half of the 20th century, then the model can go to other experiences, and we find that the model says of the post-COVID-19 inflation, only a very small amount, 0.5 percentage point, is interpreted as a permanent component. The monetary transmission mechanism, on the other hand, is estimated to be stable across the two samples, 1900 to 2021 and 1955 to now. So our point is that using long, or what we call pre-post-war historical time series, is valuable to understanding the COVID-19 shock, but it might also be valuable looking ahead. Maybe this in extreme tranquility that the economy experienced between 1955 and pre-global financial crisis of 2008 was a little bit more of an exception. What makes us think that looking at long data is becoming more important is that we have another big shock coming. Many people believe that climate change will have, of the various effects it will have on the economy, one of them is that it might raise economic volatility. And long historical time series can say something about volatile times, and at least until we have sufficient data under this new climate regime accumulated to do business cycle analysis, we might find it helpful to go back to historical time series. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I think we can open, the Q&A. And the first one who's going to ask a question is Christian.
Hi, Stephanie. Thanks a lot. Very interesting talk. So I was wondering if I combine what you said with the stuff from Ulrike Malmenier, that basically says that human beings work like Kalman filters trained on short samples. Then your actual agents that take actions in the economy will be more like the ones living in the short sample after the war.
I mean, I cannot hear the question at all. So
Okay, I'm sorry.
I
Can
cannot
we get
hear
a microphone
anything.
over there? I'm sorry, Christian. So Christian Bayer is going to repeat his question. That's easier. Otherwise, I would have repeated it, but he's talking so long I can't remember what he was saying in the beginning.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you very
excellent.
well.
Great talk. Thanks a lot. So I was wondering if I combine what you said with the insights from Ulrike Malmenier's work that says that human beings actually work more like Kalman filters trained on short samples. Then we would, living in these tranquil times, have these high Kalman gains, and everybody of us would look through the data more like, oh, this is a strong increase, so this is going to be permanent, like in your short sample. And so actual decision makers will act on that. Would that tell me that then self-fulfillingly this will be permanent?
All right. Very nice question. Very, very nice connection. So I do not have, the only thing I can say as an answer is if it was true that the fact that what Ulrike has established, that individual agents behave more like people doing Kalman filtering with a very short sample, then the puzzle is a little bit, why do we find that the impulse responses to monetary policy shocks are the same if you give the econometric model the long or the short sample, right? Because if I understood your question right, I might not have, is that you were saying if everybody is behaving with only one thing in their memory, which was the prolonged inflation of the 70s, they're gonna all behave as if it is permanent. And then it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah, you might be right, but I would have to think about how to reconcile that with my finding, or with our finding, that the impulse responses didn't change, depending on which sample I train my econometric model.
Second question is by, I'm sorry.
Just one more comment.
Yeah.
I think what also goes in Christian's direction is, as in the biography of Volker, there's a little part where they discuss Powell, and one of the things he said is that his initial spur was to give everybody a copy of this biography because that lines up very well with his views. So that would be, well, confirming probably what you indicated, namely that the short-run memory is a great inflation of the 1970s, and everybody will behave like that. So just as a comment.
The second question is by Volker Wieland.
Yeah, hi Stephanie, thank you. One question in terms of both nominal regimes and real regimes. I mean, you look at episodes with very different nominal regimes, right? You have the gold standard, interwar years, Bretton Woods, gold exchange standard, and then after Bretton Woods, kind of flexible exchange rates. So we're still in the last regime, using data from different regimes where monetary policy and money works in very different ways would seem to be less relevant, right? If you think of the gold standard, of course it was volatile, but the price level in the end was less volatile, right? It was moving around, but average inflation was lower. High inflation was followed by deflation. And in real terms, you have the same problem more recently, right? What about real interest rates? Are there different regimes? And so we might well be another regime there, compared to the 70s, but nominally we are in the same regime as in the 70s.
Yeah, okay. Hi, Volker. Thank you. Yes, also very good and very relevant question. Isn't what we are doing that we are audacious and we estimate the model from 1900 to 2021 without any break, without any change in parameters. Isn't that, I mean, I'm just repeating what you said. Doesn't this mean that you're implicitly also assuming that monetary policy was the same, and we know it wasn't the same, and we know that the price level was pretty much stable between 1800 and 1942, and then inflation started? Doesn't make that the previous episodes more relevant? Yes, that is definitely a valid criticism, and probably it would call for making an estimation with time-varying parameters. But what makes us interested in the pre-war period and taking it as face value as we do it, we just think that the lack of large shocks for whatever reason makes the post-war period perhaps not the most informative period to interpret the new environment. That's at least our conjecture.
Lucrezia Reichlin.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you. So you see that I'm the prisoner of the German audience here. I think it's interesting, but I'm a little bit unconvinced because it seems to be that your story is more about changing volatility than the permanent component. I mean, you have clear heteroscedasticity, high volatility, in the first regime and low volatility in the second regime. So you're bound to find, that decomposition on permanent and temporary. And actually, maybe this change in volatility affects your estimates. Going for, trying to build a story on an estimate of the permanent component is dangerous because that's a long-term forecast, so that has a very high uncertainty. We know that those components are very badly estimated. And then the question, I think, is related to Volker, is that there was once upon a time this debate about luck or policy to explain the low volatility of output and inflation. Maybe you're too young to remember, but that's what...
No, I do remember.
You do remember.
Don't worry.
Okay. And, there were very different monetary regimes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So maybe two things I can say. It is true that there's a literature on long-run components being difficult to estimate, and in particular, I don't know, John Faust and maybe many other people have contributed of saying the long-run identification of a Blanchard-Croix model are not very robust. So we have a slightly different econometric approach. I don't want to say that is not subject to these criticisms necessarily, but intuitively, the longer the time series is, the easier it should be to pick out the permanent components. And we do see that both the short and the long sample pick out pretty much the same permanent component for the 1970s, for the Great Inflation, right? Where they disagree is how to interpret post-COVID. One says it's all permanent, the other says it's not at all permanent. One way one could potentially address in a simple way heteroscedasticity is to allow measurement error to be different pre and post 1955, and that's probably something we have been trying to think about.
Michael Krause.
Yeah, hello, Stephanie. Thanks for your talk. I think I have something which may be a question or a suggestion. When you looked at the short sample and then the interpretation at the end that it's a permanent component in inflation that's shooting up, do we interpret it? I mean, when we look at the whole blue line throughout the 50 years, does that always tell us what people were thinking at the time? Is it a real-time estimate of the permanent component, or is it a smoothed filter, if you like? So can we interpret the spike at the end as, yeah, I mean, the data doesn't continue after the end, so that's kind of like a real-time estimate, but wouldn't it be interesting to compare over time what people would have thought the permanent component is, just as we now look at the end of your sample? Don't know whether that makes sense.
Okay, so first of all, yes, you're right. It's the smoothed out component, so it's the best Kalman filter forecast of the permanent component as of 2021, taking into account all the data in the sample up and until including 2021, right? So it's a smoothed out thing. You could also have a Kalman filter forecast which says, oh, I only want what people were thinking up until a certain date and not using all the data. But since we are looking at the very last point, that is the same, right? And so time will tell as we add more data whether that best estimate until 2021 is going to change if you add more data to it or not. So then we could answer your question. Why can't we do something better? I don't think anybody was thinking in 2019 that COVID was coming. I mean, maybe Bill Gates saw it coming, but nobody else saw it coming. So I don't have that data. So that is why we think we cannot do much about it. We can, of course, we get the state in 2021. We can then forecast what is going to happen to the permanent component, and there's a tiny bit more information there. On the long sample, the permanent component is expected to change until 2030 by 10 more basis points, whereas on the short sample, it's actually expected to increase a tiny bit more and to 0.5 percentage point even further. But I think given our data with the smoothed out state of the economy, that's, I think, what we can do.
Gerhard Siebert.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. At least I would not buy everything you said, let me pour some water in your clear wine, if possible. When comparing the first half of the last century with the second half, you say monetary policy is more or less the same as regard the transmission process, but what I see as a striking difference between the first half and the second half is a price formation process in the United States. Why have the spikes disappeared? And my answer would be that the upward and downward flexibility of prices at the micro level were quite different in those days compared with the nowadays. So in that respect, I say spikes would be very useful because they see that the market is working and gives signals in both directions, and that is completely lost in the second period. So, and that is why every shock is transmitted in a price level shift. And this price level shift is asymmetric because we have lost the downward flexibility of prices at the micro level. And therefore, I would see every shock in the wrong direction can be easily transformed in a permanent price level effect that is, in the second stage, transmitted and transformed in a second round effect. So I would not say that it is useless to compare this, but we would check the hypothesis that the price formation process has remained the same.
No, very nice comment. You know, they were, why have the spikes disappeared, right? So it could be different monetary policy. It could be, I think Volker, maybe, well, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I thought he said the price level was stabilized, whereas post-war we are stabilizing, or the Fed is stabilizing inflation, and you are bringing up a very hypothesis, I guess I like, is that you think the degree of price and wage flexibility has changed a lot. So I'm just going to make, well, I'm going to probably injure myself more with that than help, but I want to make one comment that surprised me a little bit when I'm not a historian, so, and I very superficially read about the 1915 to 19 inflation spike, right? So what is going on there? We need a lot of relative price changes, like right now, right? Because the US has, there are shortages because of World War One. There are big fiscal spending, so a lot of relative prices are supposed to change. And it is always intriguing to think about how does a relative price change come about, right? And the big red spike, at least to me, says that the relative price change comes about initially, at least, that the good whose relative price goes up has the nominal price increase. In fact, there were, like in the inflation of the 70s, there were price controls in effect that were in the US, ended in February of 2019. So why do relative price changes come about by increases in the normal price of the price that goes up? Is that because there was a downward rigidity? Maybe, maybe not, because you're going to tell me what are you talking about? By 2020, we had deflation in 2011. So I think the general thing that's quite interesting to me is, are relative price changes when the relative price has to go up nowadays always brought about by a nominal price going up? So any relative price change has long inflation because twice the normal price has to go up. And maybe what you said, or goes a little bit with what you said, is that maybe in the pre-war sample, prices were much more flexible, and every relative price change was associated with a normal price change, either up or down, depending how the price had to move. So here there was a shortage, normal prices went up, and then we had a decline of these normal prices, and normal prices went down. Yeah, could be. I don't know how to test it, but it's something interesting to think about. And I agree with you. The price level in the US during the Great Depression fell by 30%. I don't know if we could see that anymore. Yeah. So.
Franz Seitz.
Hi, Stephanie. Good to see and listen to you. If I got everything right, what you showed us is that inflation started to increase permanently, but that central banks have the power to get this right by temporarily increasing rates. Any idea how long this temporary should or will be? First question. And second short question, have you also estimated your model on other countries? For example, Germany, or your results, do you think your results can be generalized or not?
Yeah, okay. So let me first answer the first question about how we interpret the permanent component of inflation. I don't think there is a permanent component of inflation out there that is somehow like a deus ex machina created by someone. I think XM, I put squarely on the table of the FOMC. So I think the institution, this is a policy variable for me, and the institution that controls the long run level of inflation is in a country with an independent central bank, only the monetary authority, and in a country without an independent central bank is the combination of fiscal and monetary policy. So if you're like Argentina and you are depending on 3% seniorage income every year, the central banker can do nothing about it. Or maybe we now think that huge fiscal deficits are driving this. But I think XMT is something that the central bank or the combination of the central bank and the fiscal authority have entirely under their control. So that's my take on that one. But if they want to, like what the US and other economies now have to do, because there are other shocks hitting the economy, I mean, the COVID shock, and they want to bring inflation down, they have to have a transitory shock. How many years the transitory shock has to be, that depends a little bit on what shocks they respond to, but the main message has to be not, oh yes, let's talk about Germany, you asked me. Right now, I don't know, policy rate is minus 50 basis points and we're gonna go to 2% and that's gonna help it. If you want to bring inflation down, you will have to say, I'm gonna overshoot and then I'm gonna come back down. That was the point we want to make. And the other part of your question, of course, to give this talk here, I wanted to show some results for Germany, and the Schulerich and Jordan, Schulerich and Taylor database does have Germany since 1900. We haven't done it because when we looked at the raw data of Germany well, I'm German, I should have known this better. Prior to 1950, the volatility is incredible. So we haven't really decided what to do about that. So, well, maybe that's shooting ourselves in the foot because we say the highly volatile period has information that is useful to interpret COVID. But when we saw the German historical data, we weren't really sure whether it was coming from the first co-author or the second co-author's home country. So.
Do we have any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. So my name is Katrin Casanova. I'm working now at the Swiss National Bank. I'd have a question on your measure of monetary policy. You're using the interest rate and probably the short, some kind of the Fed funds rate, that's what you talked about, probably then something like a short rate as a substitute when the rate gets very low. But what about other measures like the size of central banks' balance sheets? Or my question is actually, how do you bring in the QE effect that dominates the past years?
Okay, so first, purely on the data, Jordan, Schulerich, and Taylor, they use, I think, since the 50s, the federal funds rate, and before they use a short-run treasury rate. Do we take into account the zero lower bound more generally, or what QE did? No. In that simple model, there is no accommodation for that, and so we can't really speak to did QE help? I guess if it did, mechanically it has to go to measurement error here, I think. So no, we don't say anything about whether QE helped or didn't help, or no. So that's something that potentially can be improved.
Do we have further questions? Or are you all satisfied? Or hungry? Yeah, thank you again, Stephanie, for your wonderful and insightful talk. It's been a pleasure to listen to you and to discuss with you. Usually we are supporting or appreciation with particular types of liquidity from Freiburg. It's usually, as you know, a wine region, and we cannot simply transfer the wine via the internet, but we have an outpost at NYU at the moment, actually a postdoc. So some of this liquidity should be on the way to you, and I hope this is really working fine. So give me your feedback if you receive it or not. So thank you very much again, and have a nice day and nice weekend. Thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you, and bye-bye. Bye. So we are doing now the same. We are going to the other room and have some liquidity for us, whatever you like, water or wine or champagne or something like that. This is just opposite of this room before we then go to dinner. Thank you.